Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on TMJ Political Current Podcast. A lot of us have been glued to the news, watching in horror for the past several months as the waves of detentions, deportations, and dismissals under the Trump administration has been targeting free speech and students across universities in the nation. Today, we're joined by one of the best in the field. Amir Makled is the managing partner at Hall Makled, a thriving litigation firm based in Dearborn, Michigan, and he himself was recently detained at the airport by federal immigration agents while coming back from a family vacation. He joins us today at TMJ News to discuss his experience as well as offer his advice as a lawyer witnessing the situation unfold. Thank you again, Amir, for being our guest on TMJ News today. We're actually speaking with you about a topic that recently you have experienced yourself. You are a trial lawyer who recently was detained at the airport by federal immigration agents while you were returning home from a family vacation. And this is, something that has made headlines. You have also spoken about it personally, but I want to hear from your own words. Can you walk us through what happened at the airport? And, as a lawyer who has been, who is very aware of how to deal with these situations, let's actually start with how that specifically made you feel.
Sure. First, thank you, Sanam Sarah, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to share my experience and my story. Well, it happened when I was coming back from a spring break trip with my wife and kids. I was traveling from the Dominican Republic, landing in Detroit Metro Airport. And once I arrived at the international airport, I handed my passport to the U.S. passport agents. Customs and Border Protection is the agency that handles the passport and coming in through the United States and entering for U.S. citizens and non-citizens.
Right.
And I travel internationally all the time. It's something I do at least a couple times a year, but I've never experienced when I experienced this last trip. As soon as I got to the passport desk, I was stopped by a Customs and Border Protection agent, and they subjected me to a secondary screening with a tactical terrorism response team. That was the acronym that they used, TTRT. Once I got to the Border Patrol desk or the passport agent's desk, I didn't know what that acronym stood for initially, but I looked it up while I was standing there, and that's when I realized it meant tactical terrorism response team. So my first reaction when that happened to me is I'm being randomly selected or subjected to like some racial profiling.
Right.
And so that's something that every time I've ever traveled, I felt that anxiety just being a Muslim, and being an Arab man.
Absolutely.
And I have my beard and I look like I'm an Arab man. So it's something that is, always with me when I'm traveling, but I've never been stopped until that day. And initially that was my gut reaction.
Right. And so this was the first time you're saying that you were ever stopped and questioned.
Yes.
Right. And I know actually what you mentioned, I also have not heard of that acronym, but I know a lot of Muslims are used to, the 4 S's that come on boarding passes where they know they're about to go for secondary screening. So you're saying this is actually different from that.
So the TTRT agency, they're a subset of Customs and Border Protection. It's a tactical team that Customs and Border Protection puts together for national
Right.
security concerns. And so other law enforcement agencies like the FBI or CIA or NSA or any type of intelligence agency can ask Customs and Border Protection to stop an individual. So if
Right.
you're targeted from one of these other law enforcement agencies and they know that you're coming in from another country or traveling internationally, they'll flag your name at the border. And
Right.
these other law enforcement agencies will ask Customs and Border to stop you, interview you, and seize your device. And that's what happened to me.
Right.
When I got into the secondary screening room, initially my wife and children were with me, and I asked them if they were free to go, and they allowed my wife and kids to go home. So that was very relieving for me because I was really nervous at
Right.
that point, and I've never been subjected to an interrogation from law enforcement. Although I'm used to engaging with law enforcement, in my job. I talk to FBI agents, I talk to federal agents all the time, and local police officers. It's something that I do almost every day in my work. But when you're the target of an investigation, it's really nerve-wracking. You get really concerned about it.
Right. And why do you think this time then was the first? I know you mentioned as well that it might have something to do with the fact that one of your current clients is a protester, a student protester who was
Right.
involved with the pro-Palestine protest. Do you think that might be the reason why?
It is the reason why, and I'll tell you why I know that. Once I got into the secondary screening room, I knew that I was being targeted because they led with, Mr. Makled, we know that you're an attorney, and we know that you're handling some high-profile cases, including student protesters. That's the very
Oh,
first thing that they told me. And so that at
right.
that moment, I said, this isn't a routine or random selection. This is targeted. Um,
Exactly.
and I had already been aware that the current Trump administration has been targeting attorneys. They issued a memorandum from the Justice Department just maybe 2 or 3 weeks before I was stopped at the border, and it's something that I've been discussing among my colleagues about immigration lawyers, and we were talking amongst each other as a group of Muslim lawyers who do practice in immigration, that we should be
Mhm.
mindful that the Trump administration is challenging law firms and lawyers who they believe could be filing frivolous claims for asylum for people who are non-citizens. There was also some executive orders from the Trump administration challenging some big law firms from Washington, D.C.
Right.
And some of those big law firms capitulated to the Trump administration and gave in to what the demands were. So in that moment, I knew of that current administrative history, and I knew that at the border they can take my device. It's something that I've been aware of all of my career, actually. At the border,
Right.
we don't have as many rights for the Fourth Amendment. You don't need a warrant. And the government can take your phone without a warrant, can look into your laptop without a warrant. They don't even need reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed or probable cause that you're a national security threat. They can just ask for it at the border, and they do that with they equate it to looking into like your luggage. Looking into
Right.
your device to them is the same way of looking into your luggage to see if you're carrying contraband or weapons or something coming across the border that could be a harm to others.
Right. So you were taken, questioned, and you're mentioning that they did as well ask to see your phone. Did you give up your phone for them to look at?
So what happened right after they told me that they knew I was a lawyer? And they said, "Do you have your phone on you?" And I said, "Yes, I have my phone on me." And I pulled it out of my pocket. And they gave me a pamphlet, which was my rights at the border. And I was already aware of them. So at that time, you know, I tried to change a little bit of the conversation and dynamic of the room. And this is my
Right.
lawyer hat on at this point. So I changed up the dynamic. I looked at this pamphlet and I very intentionally took my time reading it, almost to the point where the agent got annoyed. He's like, "You can look at this later." I said, "No, I'm
Right.
going to continue to read this because I don't want
Hmm.
them to control the conversation. I want to control the conversation." But I
Right.
knew that they had the right to take my device. And so at that point, they said, "Will you open your phone for us?" I said, "No." And they said, "Why not?" I said, "You already know that I'm an attorney. You said that from the onset of this investigation. And everything on my device is privileged. I have over a decade worth of emails and text messages,
Right.
communications, files, all on my device. And I practice primarily from my cell phone these days.
Right.
And as a result of me having this confidential and privileged information on my phone, I said, 'No, you're not going to get into my phone. I'm not going to give it to you.'" Um, and that really perplexed this agent. And mind you, this
Right.
is not a uniformed officer. This is a plain clothes officer. So he's wearing plain clothes. Um, and they're skilled in interrogative tactics. And so I knew that they were trying to intimidate me a bit to give up my device. He threatened me at one point. He said, "You shouldn't lie to a federal agent." I said, "I know it's a crime to lie to a federal agent, and I'm not lying to you about anything. I'm just not
Right.
going to give you access to my phone." So at that point, they kind of iced me in the room for another 20 or 30 minutes. They came back and they handed me a legal pad and they said, "Fine. Our supervisor says if you write down on a legal pad everything that you think is privileged, we won't look at that." And I said, "What are you talking about? How am I going to be in this setting right now, going to write down over 10 years of information and say, this is privilege, this is privilege, this is privilege? It's not something that we can possibly, do in this setting. I'm not going to do that."
Right.
So again, the guy got frustrated. He goes back to his supervisor and then comes back maybe another 20 or 30 minutes later. And just at this point, he's with somebody else, another person, a female,
Right.
and says, "We're taking your device unless you show us your contact list." And he asked me, do you think your contact list is privileged? I said, look, there could be, some privilege in who my clients are, but my contact list won't describe them as clients. So
Right.
I'm okay with you looking at my contact list only if that allows me to leave with my device. And so
Right.
I wrote down on that same legal pad he had given me earlier that you only have consent to look at my contact list. I do not give you authority to go into anything beyond the contact list in my phone. And everything else within my device is privileged communications, and you don't have access to it. And so I wrote
Right.
that and I signed it, and I gave that to the Customs and Border agent. And that's not something that they requested of me, but something I wanted to do just to have a reason down the road if they found something else in my phone or looked into another client's information and tried to use that subsequently. I could have
Right.
something I can use in court to challenge. And so they looked at my list just for a few minutes. They browsed through it. They didn't do a dump, but they already had a list of names of
That they were
individuals
looking
they
for.
wanted to ask me about. So they gave me
Yeah.
6 names, 5 or 6 names. All of them are people of Lebanese origin, and I'm Lebanese, and a lot of my client list is people from Lebanon, all from South Lebanon, who as we are aware of, it was recently in the war with Israel,
Right.
and people that I probably knew quite a lot of information about, and
Right.
I wasn't going to share that information with the government.
So they essentially wanted you to share
Oh yeah,
information about those
they wanted
individuals.
me to tell them how I knew these folks. What do I know about them? What's going on? I said, listen, you're not getting any of that from me. You got the
Right.
wrong guy. If their name is in my phone, it's a friend, a client, or a family member, and that's all you're going to get from me on that issue. And this whole situation took about nearly 2 hours. I was placed in a room, and it was a room that was not. I couldn't leave. I'm not free to leave. The room, the office had an alarm on the door. If you exit that door, an alarm would go off. So it wasn't something where I was in a jail cell or something along those lines, but I was definitely detained. And so not free to leave. So that's a pretty significant situation, especially for, I'm an American citizen. I'm a practicing civil rights lawyer, and I'm coming home with my kids from a vacation. Like, what threat am I to anybody? But
Exactly.
what I recognized is they're doing this to intimidate me, and they've done this with an intent to try to dissuade me from taking on some of the cases that I take, and
Right.
it's going to have the opposite effect for me. I'm somebody that is a firm believer in standing up for civil rights.
Right.
From the beginning of my career, I've been involved in civil rights cases. I was the first to file a lawsuit against a law enforcement agency for a Muslim woman's hijab being removed. And I was successful in changing that policy in Michigan. And we took that policy nationally. And the
Right.
Council on American Islamic Relations, used my policy nationally to work on different policies with other law enforcement agencies. And that's something I did maybe within the first year of me being an attorney. Um, it's now being up for a legislative bill in the state of Michigan as a result of my work to keeping, Muslim women's rights if they're ever arrested. And my client was arrested for driving while license suspended, and they
Right.
forced her hijab off, which is ridiculous. But those are the types of issues that I'm a firm believer in, and I won't be dissuaded from that. I can't. I'm going to continue to do what I think is right for me to do.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that you think these are essentially efforts to intimidate. Now, obviously, from the account that you just narrated here, you are a very experienced lawyer. You knew exactly how to deal with the officers at every point in that, questioning process. Were you at all intimidated yourself being in that situation?
You know, when my kids were around me and my wife was around me, I felt different. When they were able to go, when they left, my dad hat came off and my lawyer hat came on, and I felt way more confident to engage with them because now it's just me and I can deal
Right.
with it. But imagine if it happened to me. Imagine what happens to an undocumented family, a migrant family, a young activist, a young student who is engaging in some political activism on campus, or everyday Muslims that are coming in, immigrant families that are coming in from the Middle East. they are stopped and they don't know their rights and they don't know what they have, and how they can
Exactly.
communicate with folks. And it is so scary because you don't want to be intimidated or questioned or harassed by these government people. It's nerve-wracking.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I actually wanted to ask you now is, as a lawyer who knows how to approach this situation, you are definitely in a position where you know how to do it. Students now, not just students, but like whether it's US citizens or not, are essentially terrified from traveling. It's a sentiment that's been going on a lot now, especially with travel season coming up, is are we safe traveling with our phones, with our devices, with our laptops, anything that, could be potentially used against us if it's, gone through. As a lawyer who, knows exactly how these situations should be approached, what's your advice for people who are traveling and what are the rights that they should know they have?
I would recommend that you don't travel with a device that has sensitive data on it. So get a secondary phone that just has your phone number associated with it and some important contacts that you need to communicate with, and you can download apps and then erase them off that phone as you're coming through the border. And when you're coming through the border, turn off your device and remove facial recognition. Your rights at the border are this: if you're a citizen, they can't deny you entry into the United States. So no matter what happens at the border, they have to let you into the United States. You don't have to give them your phone in terms of access to your phone. You don't have to unlock it for them. You don't have to give them your password. You don't have to use facial recognition and give them the device so they can go through it. But they can
Right.
they can seize your device. They have that right. And if they do, there are redress programs. You can get your phone back. Sometimes the Customs and Border Protection policy is 15 days, but it can be held for much longer. And we've known cases to go as long as years in certain situations. But those are reserved for the most concerning national security threats, right? But we don't know what a national security threat is anymore. Everything that's
Exactly.
anti-Zionism or pro-Palestinian is now a threat to America's foreign policy. As what our Secretary of State Marco Rubio has recently said in the media.
Right.
So if you're a non-citizen, however, and if you're a student visa holder, or if you're a green card holder, or you're just here on a visitor visa, you can be denied entry to the United States. And so if you're coming from a foreign country and you're coming to visit here in the United States or study here in the United States, if you don't comply and open your phone, they can ask you to go back to where you're coming from. They don't have to allow you or admit you into the United States. And they could still take your device. So be mindful of that situation as well. And I recommend to those folks, don't bring any electronic device that has sensitive information, whether it's your laptop, a tablet, or an iPhone, or any type of Android. They're all the same. Anything that has electronic, you should be mindful of what the content that's in there. Because of what we're seeing, there was a physician from Lebanon, a girl who was going to Boston, and she was in Lebanon and attended apparently the funeral for Sayyid Hassan.
Right.
She was denied coming back to the United States and sent back to Lebanon, even though she was a student. I think she was a professor, maybe, or a faculty member of a university, and she was
Right.
rejected for just having, not that you're a supporter of Hezbollah or something along those lines, but just having content in regards to that. They didn't like it. You're going back. So that's,
Just that, as easy as that.
yeah.
Right.
And so that in and of itself is not a crime. I can have a photo of something in Beirut for a funeral for somebody from Hezbollah. That's not necessarily saying that you're a supporter of it. It's risky though, however, that to be on your device, because they're gonna paint that picture as being contrary to American foreign policy, and that could put you
Absolutely.
in a very difficult spot where you're going to have to explain as to why this is there and how it got there. And so I recommend to everybody, don't have this type of content on your phone. Keep a phone that is clear of any of this type of stuff.
Right. And I think the key term, the key phrase that you just mentioned is this whole idea and this rhetoric that's being spread of essentially any individual who shares or is shown to have any connection with content that could prove them to be adversarial to U.S. foreign policy interests. Now, you're a lawyer, especially when it comes to legal terms, this is an extremely broad kind of term to be using when it comes to identifying people who might fit in that category. So essentially what you're saying and what we're seeing right now is that it's become a highly, highly subjective situation where, something as small as even someone liking a certain post or certain content being found, like let's say a WhatsApp group they're part of, even that you're saying could potentially be used against them.
Absolutely. And they're not even hiding that. They're being very vocal about they are scouring social media, and they are looking for ways to remove any student visa holder who is pro-Palestinian or liking or sharing pro-Palestinian content. And it's a coordinated attempt to silence Muslim voices who stand for Palestine, and non-Muslims as well. I mean, we're seeing
Right.
nationally that you don't have to be even Arab or Muslim. In the group of 7 that I'm representing right now, none of them are Arab. None of the students that are charged with felonies for resisting they're charged with criminalization of free speech in this case. They were
Right.
part of an encampment, and they were protesting for divestment, demanding that the University of Michigan divest from the state of Israel. And they're demanding that, the University of Michigan issue a statement, in support of the Palestinian movement. But none of the students that are charged are Arab. Only one is Muslim. Actually,
Right.
more Jewish students are charged than Muslim students, which is interesting. But
That is very
it's
interesting.
it's not something that is, only for Muslims and Arab in terms of nationally, people are sick of this type of disgusting genocide that's happening in Gaza. And this is a coordinated effort to silence the speech in support of Palestinians. Students are being arrested. Lawyers are being are placed under surveillance, and entire communities are treated like we're threats. And that's not fair, and it's not fair to what we believe in. But I say to our community and to people who are like-minded and in solidarity with our movement that we can't back down from this fight. We got to continue to raise our voices and stand and get organized and stand in solidarity for the efforts that we're trying to push. We are still a nation of laws in the United States. We still have a Bill of Rights and a Constitution. And the courts will ultimately be the check and balance from an authoritarian administration that we have. Because, this current administration is here for 4 years.
Right.
The pendulum is going to swing back in the United States, as it always does. But like we saw post 9/11, when our community was under severe attack, we're back in that same position. We're under attack again. But this time we're more organized. This time we're more educated. And this time we're ready for how our response is and how we can move forward as a community to change this perspective of Muslim equals terrorist, or
Absolutely.
anti-Zionist equals anti-Semite. And those are, not the same. And we shouldn't
Exactly.
allow that to be the same.
I mean, I think the concerning part, though, right now is that as much as we do know that is the case, it almost seems as though the administration's rhetoric and the way that they are defining anti-Semitism. I know, Trump had this executive order, just even the terminology that's being used in a lot of these, laws is essentially equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And that's, kind of the basis that we're seeing when it comes to targeting students, especially who are involved in protests and encampments is, simply for even being present. We saw the situation with Mahmoud Khalil as well. Even for being present or being part of organization is going to make you a direct target. And another point that I was going to bring up, you mentioned how, we still do have laws in this country. One recent development that we know came out about Mahmoud Khalil's case as well was that the Louisiana judge said essentially his deportation cannot be blocked. So when we're dealing with certain, I guess these situations where even a judge in some cases cannot prevent something like this from happening, do you have hope that the law will eventually be able to prevent the mass deportations that we're already seeing? Or, until now, we've had more than 600 students, their visas have been revoked. Is there a way to stop this?
So yes, so what we're seeing the administration do is forum select. They're looking for judges that are going to be more sympathetic to their ideas And the immigration court is not an actual judiciary. It's a quasi. It's like an administrative court. Okay, so the
Right.
immigration court and the immigration that judge that ruled that Mahmoud Khalil can be deported is part of that same administrative hearing. Now,
Right.
he has the right to appeal, and I think he has filed his appeal, and he's got a secondary action called a habeas corpus action. Now,
Right.
those other appeals and habeas corpus actions are going to test whether they can use free speech alone, so not criminal conduct, not lying on your application for your student visa or your green card, but just your speech. Can that be used or the basis for removal and deportation? And that's the test that, excuse me, that's the test that the courts are going to have to review.
Right.
And so we're not at that point yet in Mahmoud Khalil's case. We're not at the position where they've said that a speech issue can be used for removal, and that's going to happen from a federal judge, and we'll see not from the forum selected judge from Louisiana, but from an actual federally appointed judge that's been through a Senate confirmation hearing, and has some real authority, if they'll allow that to happen. And if that judge allows that to happen, it'll go up. It'll go up the chain. It could end up to the Supreme Court even. But we
Right.
saw in another student's release, and I forget that student's name, who in Vermont, who was also a Columbia activist. He was released for the same type of thing that Mahmoud Khalil was facing, in removal and deportation, based off of his speech at Columbia University. But he got a bond and is now out and is being able to fight his removal and immigration case, free from detention. So
Right.
therein lies the distinction, right? So we have judges that are, aligning with this current administration, and then judges that aren't, and different jurisdictions. So in across the United States, it's not going to be a fair and balanced assessment. It depends on where these cases are coming from. But as it goes through the court system, we will see that, and I'm confident that we're going to fall on the right side of history. Free speech is a fundamental right. The right to
Right.
assemble is a fundamental right, and we're not going to get narrowly tailored, carved out exceptions for this type of stuff, for political dissent. Where and courts are going to say yes, we can do this. Yeah, I don't believe that's
Right.
going to happen.
Okay. And I mean, that is a big hope that a lot of, students and, citizen or otherwise that are really banking on when it comes to this process. When I was in journalism school myself, one of our courses, which involved journalism law, essentially taught us the biggest protector that you have as journalists, and this obviously applies to everyone in society, is the First Amendment guarantees that you should be able to practice your free speech, protest the government, and essentially that is the whole purpose and the point of a democracy, is to be able to do that freely. As a lawyer yourself, what do you think these recent attacks on free speech mean for law-abiding citizens who are only practicing their free speech? They are, going by the Constitution, not violating any law. What do you think it means for these law-abiding citizens, and what advice do you have for them, knowing that they could get targeted, especially students who had their careers are on the line now?
I think it's government overreach. Everything that's happening right now is really a systemic approach to stifle the pro-Palestinian content that's being pushed right now, and law enforcement is being used to prevent protesting, not violence, not crimes, but just your words. And I think that's really government overreach and excessive. Um, and it becomes a form of selective enforcement. That this type of speech is going to be targeted, but other is not. So
Right.
it's a problem. It's something that we're going to have to keep fighting back. But the advice I give is just be mindful of what you're sharing and how you're sharing it, and it's up to your own personal um, abilities to withstand some pressure. Some folks don't want to be bothered by government, and so to those
Right.
people who don't want to be bothered, that's okay. You can avoid that. You don't have to speak out on social media or have to engage in these protests. But if you're a student activist and you're somebody who's a citizen, you don't have much to be worried about because, unless the bigger concern is, if these universities are going to start removing your degrees or future employment might be targeted because you've been, have a history of being an activist. These lists that are out here, Canary and Bitar worldwide,
Exactly.
those are designed to try to intimidate folks. And once you're on those lists, you become subjected to harassment online from,
Doxing, all of that.
from all sorts of different groups and organizations. And then you're on the list for the government. So it is a very difficult time period for us. And it is going to be something we're going to struggle with as a community. But I do believe that it's going to get better for us, as it did after 9/11. I mean, who thought, after 9/11 that we would see Muslims in Congress? You're seeing Muslim elected officials all the time, especially from Michigan now, where, in my home city, in Dearborn, we've got
Right.
the best Muslim representation that in the country. And it's beautiful. We have great leaders that are now emerging from our community, and I'm proud of it.
Absolutely. And speaking to what you mentioned about students, in a case, for example, we had Rumeysa Ozturk, one example that, we also saw the footage that came out, the way she was approached by officers. If students were faced in that situation where, a similar case, officers approach them or they are now being subjected to law enforcement, how should they approach that situation?
Be mindful of what you tell law enforcement. Yeah, again, even if you're a non-citizen, if you're being detained by law enforcement and they're going to send you to some detention center or some criminal, jail, you don't give up your right to remain silent. You can keep silent. You don't have to talk to law enforcement. You don't have to give them any information, and try not to divulge. This is different than a border search. This is when you're in America and you're being arrested by ICE or Immigration Customs Enforcement. You don't give them any information. You don't have to talk to them. Get a lawyer, and you're entitled to
Right.
one in that situation.
Absolutely. And so kind of to wrap this conversation up, you're a lawyer, you've seen so many different cases over the years and your expertise of people getting engaged with law enforcement, facing consequences of things that they have done. Have you ever seen anything to this degree? I guess how dramatic it's all become and the amount of kind of hype that is surrounding the way the government is cracking down on students and their rights to free speech. Do you think that this is unprecedented, something we have never seen before? Or do you think it's, another wave similar to previous cases? I know you mentioned 9/11 and the surveillance of Muslims, but how would you compare this situation to other examples you have seen throughout your professional
So
career?
historically, America has always had waves of, when political dissent comes around, that they act like this. So if we
Right.
let's look at to Vietnam protesting, in the 60s and 70s. Students were arrested back then as well on campus. People were subjected to, to trials for, what they believed was inciting riots. There was a
Right.
famous case of the Chicago 8, that, and there's movies about them now to this day about their protest work, in anti Vietnam War at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We saw Black Panthers who were, you know, killed. They went into a home of a Black Panther and murdered him.
Right.
And the FBI did that. The civil rights movement of the 60s was far more violent from the government perspective. They were actually, involved in assassinations, in my opinion. So, we're not at that point, thankfully. So there is a history of America being involved in this type of strong
Cracks
condemnation
down.
of
Mhm.
and cracking down on dissent. If we look at the McCarthy era, when there was, the threat of communism, and people
The
were
Red
were
Scare.
right.
Mhm.
So this is history repeating itself. But
Absolutely.
again, we went through those phases in American history, and out of those history came, the Civil Rights Act that we saw in the 60s. New legislation came out and with broader protections for people and their rights. So there's always a silver lining, when these things happen. we're going through a stress test right now in the United States, and this government the current administration is very litigious on these issues. They want to test our, these rights. They want to test their positions, and the courts will ultimately be our savior. That's our last line of defense. We need more
Right.
attorneys to be speaking out on this issue, and we need everybody in our community to be speaking out in support of what we believe in. But
Right. And so,
go
yeah.
ahead. I think that it's going to change, though. I think we're gonna be in the right side of history.
And, looking at history, as you mentioned, so many relevant examples, and as well, what you're seeing right now as a lawyer unfolding, what do you think that silver lining is this time?
We're now finally seeing that America is waking up to the blind support for the state of Israel. We're now seeing the underbelly of how disgusting the Israeli administration has been when it comes to Palestinian issues. We're seeing how deep ingrained Israeli foreign policy is in the United States, and how their stronghold on American Congress and American politics is, and how it's going, through the universities, and how being, an anti-Zionist or somebody that's against the Zionist movement is being so attacked with such strong force that I think the American public are now saying, "Hey, what's going on here? Are we still in America? Why are we
Exactly.
supporting this foreign nation?" And now more than ever, are we seeing, those voices coming up among different backgrounds that are not Arab and Muslim. And that's amazing in my perspective, because they're now seeing what we've always known to be true, that, we're not a terrorist identity. We're not somebody that's anti-peace. Arabs and Muslims and Arab Americans are in support of trying to live peacefully. Palestinians have the right to live with sovereignty in their own country, and they should have that right. And
Right.
so I think that that's going to be the ultimate silver lining here. And then hopefully we'll have some real solid rulings from courts of high jurisdiction, like the Supreme Court, that will put an end to this type of behavior from any new administration in the future.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amir, for joining us at TMJ News to cover this important topic. And thank you so much for all the advice you gave us.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you. Masaleme.
Thank you. If you like what you see here at TMJ News, please like and share and subscribe to our channel for more engaging weekly content. TMJ News is a grassroots independent media outlet, and you can find ways to support us by reading the caption below. Thank you for joining us on this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time.